are the biggest gaming leaks and news you've probably missed this week. This PS6 leak, yeah, this one's gonna get people arguing, because on the surface, it sounds like a normal next-gen rumor. But once you actually look at the details, it starts to feel like a real shift in how consoles might work. So the info is coming from Kepler_L2, someone who's been pretty consistent with AMD-related leaks, especially when it comes to hardware like this. And the claim is that the PS6 bill of materials is sitting around $760. That's just what it costs Sony to build it. Not profit, not retail, just the raw cost. And historically, Sony would take that hit, sell the console at a loss, and make the money back through games and the ecosystem. So naturally, the expectation is, okay, they'll probably push it down to $699. But here's where it gets interesting. That's not guaranteed anymore, because the market has changed, and more importantly, the competition isn't what it used to be. There's even talk that Sony might not feel the need to subsidize as aggressively this time, especially if Xbox isn't applying the same pressure it did in previous generations. So now you're looking at a scenario where the console could launch expensive, or at least not as aggressively priced as before. And then you look at the actual configuration, and this is where people started raising eyebrows. 1 terabyte SSD, no disk drive, fully digital. And yeah, that's not surprising, but it still hits different when you hear it out loud, because this isn't just an optional digital version anymore. This could be the default. The reason is simple though, cost cutting. The disk drive is one of the easiest things to remove, and if most people are already buying digitally, Sony has every reason to lean into that. But the storage part, that's where things get a bit more interesting, because 1 terabyte sounds small by today's standard, especially when games are hitting 100, even 150 gigabytes. But the argument here is that new compression tech could completely change that. There's talk about neural texture compression, which basically uses machine learning to shrink game file sizes way more efficiently than current methods. And if this actually works the way early testing suggests, we're talking about massive reductions. A 150 gigabyte game dropping down to around 20-something gigabytes. If that happens, suddenly 1 terabyte doesn't feel as limiting anymore. But there's still uncertainty around which version Sony would use. AMD has its own approach, but Nvidia already has a working SDK that even supports AMD hardware. So ironically, Sony could end up using Nvidia-style tech on an AMD-powered console just because it's ready. And then there's the bigger picture. This console is expected to run on AMD's next-gen architectures, RDNA5 and Zen 6, which basically means a big leap in both graphics and CPU performance. So performance is not the concern here. The real shift is in how the console is positioned. More digital, more dependent on compression tech, potentially more expensive, less focused on physical media entirely. And that's where this stops being just a spec leak and starts feeling like a direction change. Because if PS6 launches fully digital, that's not just a hardware decision. That's Sony saying the physical era is basically over. So now the question is, if the PS6 is digital only, potentially more expensive, but way more efficient with storage, are you in? Or is that a deal breaker for you? Not gonna lie, I hated this game the first weekend. Like, actually hated it. I uninstalled it. Sat there for 2 days thinking about how much I didn't like it, trying to convince myself I made the right call, and then I reinstalled it just to prove that I was right. And now I'm sitting here like, I genuinely don't even know how to explain what this game is. Because it's flawed. Very flawed. But at the same time, it's kind of a masterpiece. Yesterday, I spent 2.5 hours in one random area, just walking around, looking at stuff, not even doing anything productive. And I didn't feel bored once. And that's when it clicked for me. The game doesn't get better after 8 hours. You do. You slow down. You stop playing it like every other game. You start paying attention again. It almost feels like you're waking up from that autopilot mode most games put you in. Like you've been in this gamer fatigue for years, just going through objectives, checking boxes, and suddenly this game forces you to actually engage again. And then stuff like this happens. I went out to do a simple quest, just looking for some pet armor. Then I see a tower, and I'm like, all right, what's up there? That leads me to a cave. The cave leads to like 50 bandits. 3 hours later, I stop and realize, wait, the pet armor quest. I check the map. I'm 4,000 meters away from where I was supposed to be. So I grab my horse, start heading back, get distracted again, then again. And by the time I finally get back, I realize it wasn't even really a pet armor quest. It was just doing someone a favor so you don't get tranquilized when entering a town. And none of that, literally none of that, had anything to do with the main story. And somehow, that's the game. It just pulls you away from what you thought you were doing. And you don't even mind. At this point, I'm not even sure I want to play anything else until Marvel's Wolverine or Grand Theft Auto 6 drops, because this kind of experience, you don't get it often. Crimson Desert just got a new patch, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this feels like a completely different game compared to launch. I'm running it on a 5060 Ti with 16 gigabytes of VRAM and 32 gigabytes of RAM, and the difference from day one is honestly kind of crazy. We're talking about roughly a 20 frames per second improvement overall, which is massive for a game this demanding and immediately noticeable the moment you start playing. At 1440p using DLSS performance with ray reconstruction enabled and no frame generation, I'm getting somewhere between 45 and 55 frames per second. That alone already feels much smoother than what we had before. But the real jump happens when you turn on frame generation at 3x. At that point, the game is pushing around 130 FPS. And what surprised me is that latency actually feels better than it did at launch, which is not something you usually expect when stacking these features. Visually, this is where things get really interesting. DLSS 4.5 with ray reconstruction in performance mode actually ends up looking better than native in a lot of scenes. I know that sounds wrong at first, but once you see how stable the image is and how much cleaner everything looks in motion, it starts to make sense. That being said, indoor lighting without ray reconstruction still needs work, so it's not perfect yet, and there are still areas that clearly need more polish. But the biggest improvement for me is not even the visuals, it's the controls. At launch, the game felt heavy and kind of clunky, like your inputs were slightly delayed or not translating properly. Now it feels responsive. The character actually does what you expect, and that alone changes how the entire game feels to play. It's the kind of fix that makes you realize how much the original experience was being held back. And this isn't just a PC improvement either. The PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 5 Pro both got noticeable boosts to frame rate and image stability. On the base PlayStation 5, performance mode finally has FSR3 upscaling, which it didn't have at launch, so the image looks much cleaner at 60 FPS. It's still not perfect, but it's a big step in the right direction and makes the mode actually viable now. The PlayStation 5 Pro is a bit surprising. The image noise from the PSSR2 upscaler is actually less noticeable than what I'm seeing on PC in some cases. It sounds counterintuitive, but it means the console version doesn't rely as heavily on ray reconstruction to stabilize the image, which is interesting when you compare both platforms side by side. On the PC side, Pearl Abyss has also addressed DLSS flickering issues and confirmed they're continuing to patch those problems, so it's clear this isn't the final state of the game yet. There's still work to be done, but the direction is definitely positive. At this point, I'm honestly tempted to continue playing on PC just because of how good ray reconstruction looks, even if that means leaning into frame generation more than I normally would. In the right conditions like this, the trade-off actually feels worth it. So now the real question is, does this patch change the narrative around the game enough to bring people back, or did the launch already push too many players away for it to recover? Saros just showed up, and if you've played Returnal, you already know why people are paying attention. Now on the tech side, it's already confirmed to be enhanced for PlayStation 5 Pro, and if Returnal is anything to go by, that's where things get interesting. Housemarque doesn't just make good-looking games, they make games that push visual effects hard, especially with particles, lighting, and chaos on screen. So when they say Pro Enhanced, you already know it's going to matter. Then you get into the actual game, and this is where it starts to stand out. Saros takes place on a planet called Carcosa, and you play as Arjun Devraj, a Soltari enforcer trying to figure out what happened on this lost colony that's basically stuck under a constant eclipse. So right away, the tone is darker, more oppressive, more mysterious. But here's the shift compared to Returnal. This time, it's not just environmental storytelling and scattered logs. They're leaning more into narrative, voiceover, cinematics, actual conversations with NPCs, and these things called Soltari holograms that slowly piece together what happened on the planet. So instead of just feeling lost, you're actually uncovering something. And yeah, that voice might sound familiar because Arjun is played by Rahul Kohli, and from what they've shown so far, the performance is meant to be more grounded, less abstract, more human compared to what we got in Returnal. Now gameplay, this is where it gets interesting. Returnal was all about movement and survival, always reacting, always dodging. Saros flips that a bit. This game wants you to push forward. You've got this Soltari shield that lets you absorb enemy attacks and convert that energy into power weapons, basically turning defense into offense. So instead of avoiding danger, you're encouraged to run straight into it and use it. But there's a catch. Using that power corrupts you. Your arm literally transforms into this eclipse-fueled weapon, which gives you an edge in combat, but also comes with consequences. So every fight becomes a risk-reward decision. Do you play safe, or do you push harder and deal with the corruption? And then there's the progression system, which is another big change. In Returnal, death resets a lot of your progress. Here, you still die, but you come back stronger. You can permanently upgrade your suit, your abilities, your loadout, and even keep certain weapons across runs. So it's less punishing and more about long-term growth. After death, you end up in this hub called the Passage, where you can upgrade your armor through something called the Armor Matrix, increase your survivability, and prep for the next run. And once you unlock areas, you can fast travel back into them, which means you're not starting from zero every time. So the loop feels more controlled, more intentional. You're building towards something instead of just surviving. They've also added modifiers that let you tweak difficulty, either making things easier or way harder, but you have to balance those choices, so you can't just stack advantages without consequences. And on top of all that, the eclipse itself is not just visual. It actively affects the world. Enemies become more aggressive, environments change, and certain attacks can even reduce your maximum health until you cleanse them. So the entire game world is constantly shifting around you. And that's where this starts to click. Because on the surface, yeah, it looks similar to Returnal. Fast combat, roguelike structure, sci-fi setting. But once you dig into it, this feels like Housemarque taking everything they learned and pushing it further. Even GameSpot's early impressions leaned into that idea, saying that while the similarities might hold some people back at first, after a few hours, it becomes clear the studio is building on that foundation with way more control and intention. So now the question is, does Saros end up being Returnal 2.0, or does it actually surpass it? Pragmata just hit gold, which means, yeah, this thing is actually real now. After all the delays, all the silence, all the "is this game even still happening" moments, Capcom is finally locking it in for April 17th, 2026 on PlayStation 5. And hitting gold is a big deal, because it means the base version of the game is done. It's ready to be printed on discs, shipped out, and whatever happens next is just polishing and day one patch territory. Capcom even said it straight up. They've got Gold Master approval, and they're basically in that final stretch where the team is just waiting to get it into players' hands. But here's the thing, Pragmata has always been one of those weird ones. Like from the moment it was revealed, it didn't look like anything else Capcom was making. You've got this sci-fi setting, a lone astronaut type character, a mysterious little girl, and this almost surreal tone where you're not even fully sure what's real and what isn't. It's set in a futuristic environment with a heavy focus on AI, space, and what looks like some kind of broken or abandoned system. The gameplay we've seen hints at a mix of action and puzzle elements, where you're not just shooting your way through everything. You're interacting with systems, hacking, manipulating the environment. It's Capcom trying something new, and that's where the interest comes from. But also the risk, because new IP at this scale, especially in today's market where games cost a lot more to make, doesn't get much room to fail. It either lands and becomes something bigger, or it quietly disappears. And Capcom has been on a run lately. Between Resident Evil, Street Fighter, Monster Hunter, they've been consistent. So now the question is whether Pragmata continues that streak or breaks it. RAM prices are finally dipping a bit. And yeah, it feels like relief after months of getting absolutely cooked trying to upgrade a PC. Because not long ago, memory prices were just climbing non-stop, and it wasn't random. AI companies were buying up massive amounts of RAM for data centers, which squeezed supply everywhere else. So even if you were just trying to build a normal rig, you were basically competing with billion-dollar infrastructure. Now things are shifting slightly. Prices are coming down, some kits dropping around $30 to $40. And for the first time in a while, it feels like you can breathe a little when you check prices. But here's the part people need to understand. This is not a real reset. It's more like a pause. The main reason prices dipped is because of a few changes on the AI side. One of the big ones is this new compression tech from Google called TurboQuant, which can reduce how much memory certain AI workloads need. So naturally, the market reacts, demand expectations cool slightly, and prices follow. At the same time, there are reports that OpenAI has had some funding pressure recently significantly, which also affects how aggressively companies are buying hardware. So you combine those two things, and yeah, you get a dip. But when you actually look at the numbers, it's not that impressive. A kit like Corsair Vengeance 32 gigabytes dropped from around $400 to about $370. That sounds good, until you realize that same kit used to be under $100 at one point. So yeah, cheaper than last month, but still expensive compared to what people are used to. And that's why analysts are basically saying, don't get too excited, because AI demand hasn't gone anywhere. This TurboQuant thing helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. It's an efficiency improvement, not a replacement. Big AI systems still need huge amounts of memory, and that underlying demand is still there, which means long-term, prices are still under pressure. In fact, some manufacturers are already hinting at price increases again going into next year. So this little drop we're seeing right now, it might just be a temporary window, not a trend. So now I'm curious, are you buying now while it's slightly down? Or are you still holding out hoping prices crash harder? Co-op in Crimson Desert sounds like one of those ideas that instantly makes sense the moment you think about it, because the combat already feels like it was built for shared chaos, different playstyles colliding, and those unpredictable moments that would hit even harder with another player involved. You can already picture it. One player going aggressive, pulling attention, another stepping in with heavier hits or different abilities, switching roles mid-fight, especially in boss encounters where coordination would completely change how those fights play out. Even something like a dedicated boss rush mode with co-op alone would bring in a whole new wave of players who are currently just watching from the sidelines. And that part is real. There are people holding off right now, not because the game looks bad, but because they are waiting to see how it evolves. The moment you add a co-op mode, even a limited one, that hesitation turns into interest pretty quickly. But here's where the conversation shifts, because this is not just a flip the switch and add multiplayer situation. Pearl Abyss has already been experimenting with co-op internally, and according to the CEO, it is proving to be a major technical challenge. The biggest issue is not gameplay design, it is the visuals. To make multiplayer work in a world this detailed, they are having to sacrifice graphical fidelity, and that creates a real problem, because Crimson Desert is not just another open-world RPG where visuals are optional. A huge part of its identity is how dense, reactive, and visually impressive the world feels. The lighting, the physics, the environmental detail, all of that is part of the experience. So now you are dealing with a trade-off. You can have co-op, but you might lose some of that visual quality. And if the downgrade is noticeable, players are going to feel it immediately, especially now after the recent patches have improved performance, image stability, and overall presentation across both PC and console. That is why this is still in the research phase. They are testing it, pushing it, and trying to find a balance where multiplayer can exist without breaking what makes the game special. At the same time, it is hard to imagine them abandoning the idea completely. This is a studio with MMO roots. They understand how powerful multiplayer is for longevity. It keeps players engaged, brings people back, and opens the door for expansions and long-term content in a way single player alone cannot. And from a business perspective, it just makes sense. Even a separate co-op mode focused on combat, bosses, or repeatable challenges would be enough to drive a huge spike in player interest without needing to redesign the entire campaign. So now the situation becomes less about whether co-op should exist, and more about how far they are willing to go to make it happen. Because if adding multiplayer means cutting back on visuals, performance, or that next-gen feel, then it stops being a clear upgrade and turns into a compromise. And that is the real tension here. The idea of co-op could make Crimson Desert much bigger than it is right now, but only if it does not come at the cost of what made people interested in the first place. If they do add co-op, but you can clearly see the visual downgrade, are you still jumping in with a friend, or would you rather they keep the experience exactly as it is? This one feels a bit heavier than the usual AI talk, because it is not some vague future scenario anymore. It is someone getting called into a room and being told their job is gone. A former translator from Warhorse Studios, the team behind Kingdom Come, says they were let go and their role is being replaced entirely by AI. According to their post, there was no warning, no slow transition, just a meeting where they were told their position would become obsolete because the studio plans to use AI for all translations going forward in order to be more efficient and save money. money. And when you look at it from the company side, you can understand why this is happening. Translation is one of those areas where AI has become extremely fast and cheap, especially when you are dealing with huge RPGs that have massive amounts of text. If a system can process thousands of lines instantly and cut costs at the same time, that is going to be very hard for any studio to ignore. But then you read what he actually worked on, and the situation starts to feel very different. He handled dialogue, quest logs, item names, and all the little pieces of text that shape how a game feels when you play it. That is not just technical work. That is tone, context, and meaning. That is making sure a joke lands, or a character sounds right, or a line does not feel awkward in another language. He also mentioned that discussions about AI had already been happening internally, and he had openly pushed back against it, but he did not expect it to cost him his job this quickly. That part is important, because it shows this was not some sudden discovery. This was a direction the studio had been moving toward, and at some point, they decided the human role was no longer necessary. What makes it hit harder is how he describes it. He talks about feeling betrayed, about losing not just the job, but the people he worked with every day, and about being blindsided by the decision. It is not framed as a transition or a collaboration with new tools, it is framed as being replaced. And this is where the bigger conversation starts to get uncomfortable. Because on one side, this is exactly what companies are expected to do. If there is a way to reduce costs and speed up production, especially in an industry where budgets are already exploding, they are going to take it. We just talked about games costing hundreds of millions to make, so every department becomes a target for optimization. But on the other side, this is not some small task being automated. This is creative work being removed. Translation in games is not just swapping words, it is adapting tone, culture, and intent, so the experience feels natural in another language. If that layer loses quality, players might not notice it immediately, but over time, it changes how the entire game feels. There is also the ripple effect. If one studio does this, and it works, others will follow. Not because they want to, but because they have to stay competitive. And suddenly, this stops being one person's story and becomes a shift across the entire industry. At the same time, there is still a big question hanging over all of this. AI can be fast, but can it actually match the nuance of a human translator in a complex RPG? Can it keep character voices consistent, handle humor properly, and avoid awkward phrasing across thousands of lines? Or are we going to start seeing more games where something just feels slightly off, even if players cannot immediately explain why?